Good evening, everyone. It is my pleasure to welcome Professor Marcos Benevides. Marcos is an associate professor in linguistics at JF Oberlin University and an award-winning author and material writer in English language teaching. He is well known for his work in task-based language teaching and for co-authoring Widgets Inc., a task-based course for workplace English. Today, he will guide us through the fundamentals of TBLT and help us better understand how tasks can support meaningful language learning. Please join me in welcoming Professor Marcos Benevides.
Okay, thank you very much, Mariana, and Heather as well, and the Tokyo chapter for inviting me. As Mariana mentioned in her kind introduction, my name's Marcos. I'm a professor at Oberlin University here in Tokyo. And in that capacity, I actually wear a couple of hats. One of them, of course, is as a language teacher. So I use task-based learning in my own classroom and have done so for many years. But also, I teach linguistics courses and specifically second language acquisition, in which I teach about task-based language teaching and the research and theory that underlies it to many students who are pre-service English teachers here in Japan who go on to become language English teachers in the Japanese school system. And also, I'm the coordinator of quite a large language program here in our university in which we include task-based learning as one of the main components of the curriculum. And finally, I also am a materials writer. I have a small publishing company that I founded a number of years ago. And this is relevant to today's talk because of a book that I wrote called Widgets, which Mariana mentioned just a minute ago, which came out in 2008, quite a while ago now, 18 years. And at the time it came out, it was originally with Pearson, and it was arguably the first textbook that had a strong approach to task-based learning that worked as a textbook. So I'm sitting here today drinking my coffee out of a TBLT mug that I got last year at the international conference in the Netherlands. And I'm kind of thinking that maybe it's not necessary anymore to have this kind of presentation. I've given this kind of presentation many times in the past, kind of basics of TBLT. But in recent years, TBLT has really surged and now has, I think, quite a strong position as one of the leading ways of teaching English in the classroom. Last year, for example, we had one of the plenaries at IATEFL. Neil Macmillan was on TBLT. There were a number of TBLT-related presentations in this year's IATEFL, as well as some that were sort of related to TBLT, like, for example, project-based learning and dogma, emergent language. There was a plenary this year on emergent language, which is also relevant for TBLT. In the JOLT journal, here local for us in Japan, Rod Ellis has published a new article in which he addresses some of the issues and sort of ongoing questions that teachers have about TBLT. And that article itself is very similar to one that was published by Mike Long, one of the big proponents of TBLT back in 2016, in which he addressed misunderstandings about TBLT, as well as some real issues that are ongoing. Now, one of the real issues, one of the real problems, some of the real problems come down to these three questions I've got written down here. They're very crucial to TBLT and how TBLT works. And sometimes they're a little bit difficult to answer. So what I'm hoping to do today is to touch on these three and give you specific examples that will help you, I hope, to understand how TBLT is actually very practical and works in the classroom in a practical way. So let's just jump right into it. First of all, what is a task? And I want to go back to some of the established definition, which this is drawn from Ellis and Shintani 2014. I've only got 3 points here. I'm missing one. Perhaps you can tell me which one is missing. But basically, the most important one is there's a primary focus on meaning. This is absolutely, there's no debate about this. There's no debate among proponents of TBLT. TBLT is about meaning. There's a primary focus on meaning, which means there is not a primary focus on language forms practice. Okay? Now, this is absolutely crucial to keep in your mind. There is not a primary focus on language forms practice. Now, a question that always comes up is, what do? We're language teachers. How can we not teach the language? Of course, there is teaching of the language, but it's not primary. It's secondary. Primary, we focus on meaning. And we don't teach explicitly as much as possible, although there may be some situations in which you could do that. This primary focus on meaning is very important. Also very important is that learners must rely on their own resources, at least at the beginning of the task cycle, which basically means they are not pre-taught what to do. Okay? So you present them with a task, they jump into the task, they try to do it, and perhaps at some point in that process, they will have questions. They will hit some blocks. They will not be able to accomplish the task because they might need some vocabulary or grammar form that's important, at which point that language emerges, right? The need for that language emerges, the point of need. And the teacher then can address it, right? So secondarily, but the primary focus is on the meaning. And finally, tasks must have a clear communicative outcome. And very importantly, they must be assessed based on that outcome. Okay, so let's look. Well, first of all, what's missing here? Does anyone know? You can just shout it out if you've got your mic. What's missing here from Ellis and Shintani's definition is a gap. They say that it also requires, TBLT requires a gap, which is a reason to communicate. And that's an important concept, and it's especially important in the classroom as we design tasks. We keep that in mind, that we need a gap. The reason I don't tend to include it in my definition is because, to me, that gap is part of this focus on meaning. To me, a focus on meaning implies a gap. There is something to be communicated. Otherwise, it's not a focus on meaning. So to me, it seems a little bit superfluous, but I understand why he includes it, why they include it. And it's because at the point where the teacher is designing the lesson, it's nice to have that concept at the forefront of your mind. It helps you to design tasks that are meaningful in the end. So this is a basic definition, but let's look at some examples. So what I do actually when I'm trying to explain this to my students and how it works is I create this analogy that there are two basic ways of teaching a language. There are two basic sort of learning theories about how we learn languages, okay? Two basic approaches, let's say. One of them is what we might call a synthetic approach. And by the way, let me pause here for a moment and to say, some of you, of course, this is very basic information. You know this very well already. The reason I'm presenting it here isn't so much to teach you about what a synthetic approach is, but to give you an analogy that might work when you have to present it to your own students or to your colleagues to kind of show how TBLT fits into a grander scheme. So in a synthetic approach, we learn little by little. Now, piece by piece, and we build up these pieces until we have knowledge, right? So what we have here is a photograph of a bowl of marbles. A photograph is data rich, right? There's a lot of data here. How do we copy this data from one place to another, right? The analogy here is learning. Learning a language is, let's say, how do we copy the language into your brain, right? Well, we can do that by learning piece by piece, little by little, and feeding it into your brain little by little. And eventually you have a full copy of the thing, right? And that's what a synthetic approach does. So what we're looking at is actually what artists do when they want to copy an image, right? They create this grid, and then they focus on accuracy, and they go little by little, piece by piece, until they have an accurate photo in the end, an accurate image, right? Now, this works very well for this purpose, right? When you're copying an image like this, it only takes a couple of hours, and so it's easy to do. Language learning doesn't quite work this way, because although language learning is very complex as well, it's infinitely more complex than an image like this, right? And the pieces of the language are, they may as well be infinite. Of course, it's not technically infinite, but if we're talking about vocabulary, a million words or more in the English language, depending on how you define what a word is. When you look at grammar points, all the grammar points you have to learn. When you look at things like pragmatics and all the pragmatics functions that we have to learn, if we were to teach that little by little, we would never really get to the end, at least not in a meaningful time frame, right? An artist can do this in a couple of hours, and that's no problem. But for a learner to get to this point where they get to the end, learning a language this way, would take months, and it's very demotivating, right? Our brains don't work like computers in this sense. So what do we do? Well, the other approach, the other way of learning, is what we might call a holistic approach. Now, if you're very familiar already with language teaching, you already know that synthetic approach, you can slot in there, the grammar translation method. You've got, you can call it a traditional approach, and so on. A holistic approach, likewise, you might call it communicative, you might call it a more natural approach to learning. But basically, these are the two sort of ways that you can teach a language. And so what do we do in a holistic approach? Well, we focus on meaning right from the beginning. What does that look like? It might look like this, right? This is what a beginner language learner might produce. Again, we're using an analogy, but a very simple task, right? Is this a good bowl of marbles? Is it accurate? No, of course it's not, right? It's not great, but it's meaningful. It's meaningful right from the beginning, right? That's the point of a holistic approach, and that's the point of task-based learning. It's always meaningful from the beginning. So one of the questions that often comes up in TBLT, or one of the issues that is presented, is that, well, TBLT doesn't work with very low-level learners. It does. It does work with very low-level learners. It doesn't work only if you're expecting them to be accurate and fluent from the beginning. Of course, that you're not going to get that. But if your expectation is for them to be meaningful from the beginning, then certainly you can do it, right? And you would go through a series of tasks like this. Each attempt would improve. You would give feedback, right? So imagine you're an art teacher and you're giving feedback to the student. What might you say? You know, you might tell them, you know, let's focus on shading, right? Here's how you do some shading, and then you present them with some feedback, right? Here's how you do shading. And then perhaps the next time they do it, you might get something like this. And so you're increasing in complexity. You're doing the task, and at each point, it's meaningful, right? Right? This is, how do you assess this, for example, right? By outcome. What's the outcome? Is it a bowl of marbles? Yes, right? Is it a bowl of marbles? Yes. Is it a bowl of marbles? Yes, right? So at each point, you're assessing by that outcome. And that's what we mean when we say we assess tasks by outcome. Now, we assess it primarily by meaning. So we say, yes, it's a bowl of marbles. But then secondarily, you look at you can look at the linguistic features and provide feedback on that. And you can say secondarily, you know, yes, it's a bowl of marbles. It's great. You did it. You've achieved the task. Here's what you can do next time to get better, right? And that's how the instructional cycle works in TBLT. So basically, you're moving towards this, what we might call a real world target. This is the term that Mike Long uses, right? He calls a target task is what's done in the real world. A pedagogical task is what's done in the classroom, and the point is to get the pedagogical tasks step by step getting better and better until you get towards as close as you can get to that target task that's actually done in the real world. And that's basically how TBLT works. And I again provide this analogy to my students to give them a kind of broader sort of intuitive understanding of TBLT. So a synthetic approach, again, piece by piece, builds up piece by piece. The focus is on accuracy, meaning is secondary. And I don't mean to say, by the way, that a synthetic approach doesn't work, right? Clearly, we can think that there are things we learn this way, right? I mean, art is one example. Can you think of any other examples of things you learn through a synthetic approach? The example I like to give is karate. Right? Or any sport for that matter, right? What do you do when you practice karate? You practice the kata, you practice how you stand, and then you get your sensei who comes over and says, no, your hand, you got to move it, you know, put your hand here, put your hand there. What are you doing? You're focusing on accuracy, on being right all the time, because underlying this approach to learning is the idea that if you do it the wrong way, you're going to learn a mistake, right? And that's underlying the sort of approach to learning. But we do learn some things that way. We learn karate, we learn other sports. I remember when I had to learn baseball, I had to stand with my hand this way, not this way, right? There was a pattern that I had to follow correctly before I could actually hit the ball, before they would allow me to play. So you have that kind of delayed gratification, which doesn't matter so much with something like karate, because karate only has a couple of hundred combinations of kata, right? So you can actually learn them and memorize them one by one. It's not a big deal. Language, again, is almost infinitely complex. So if you're going to learn little by little and only focus on accuracy, then you're never going to get to the end. But it doesn't mean that a synthetic approach is useless. There are certainly uses for it, and certainly there are uses for it in language teaching as well, perhaps used in combination. Ellis, in his article, again, I encourage you to read it, this article in the Jalt Journal in May 2026. He makes the point that perhaps he calls it a hybrid approach is the way to go, in which you have TBLT, proper TBLT, and a more synthetic approach, a more grammar-based approach at the same time, but not together. And I think this is a crucial point, right? Not together. if you try to put them together, they sort of pollute each other, and you revert to a grammar syllabus. But you can, so he uses the word hybrid. I would use a different word personally. I think it's more, you would call it a dual approach, where you have two kinds of teaching in the classroom. We do this in our program, which Mariana will be familiar with. In our program here at the university, we have a project-based or a task-based component, which is separate from the textbook that we also use, right? We use them both, but not together. And an ongoing question that I get from teachers all the time is, well, can I use this language that is in the textbook? Can I use that when we make our projects? And I have to say, like, no, keep them separate. It's a little bit unintuitive sometimes for teachers to get their head around, but it's really important to keep them separate. And a holistic approach is very important to focus on meaning primarily. And the improvement comes through that feedback along with task repetition. And task repetition here, by the way, isn't drilling. We're not talking about drilling. We're talking about an opportunity to do a similar task type, ideally. You don't want to be drawing bowls of marbles again and again and again, right? But you might draw different still life things. And so that's a way of redoing the task. In a language learning scenario, you might do something like a simple presentation, or something like a poster presentation that's followed by a more formal presentation that's maybe followed by something that's, a group presentation that's longer and more complex, right? You would be doing, another example is, a task could be something like, let's say you're ordering a pizza by telephone. That would be a relatively simple task. And then you give the student feedback, and then next they order, perhaps they're making a hotel reservation. And then above that, something a little more complex, maybe a flight booking or something like that. So you're doing a similar task as much as possible, but it's not complete repetition. You're not doing exactly the same thing again and again. Other ways that we can think of tasks, we can think of task features, and Ellis talks about open and closed and unfocused and focused tasks. The basic idea here is that an open task is a task that doesn't have one particular way of doing. You're not going to one particular conclusion, whereas a closed task does have an answer. So an example to that might be a relatively open task might be something like talk about your weekend. Whereas a more closed task would be, discuss with your friend and decide which restaurant to go to. So that decision is then the outcome. So having made that decision. Unfocused or focused refers to focused or unfocused on language forms. So you could have a task in which the teacher is not particularly anticipating a particular kind of language use, language form or skill. Versus one where you might have a focus. You might be sort of anticipating that the students might be doing some particular language function. A good example of that would be, for example, let's say you want to focus on the past tense. You might set up a task in which the students talk about their summer vacation, for example. And in that case, without pre-teaching the language, you would set up that task. And through trying to talk about what happened in the past, they would be likely to be using the past tense, right? So that would be a focused task. Whereas unfocused would be simply if the teacher didn't didn't have such an expectation. And as I mentioned before, real world versus pedagogic is Mike Long's distinction. Real world meaning the authentic thing that happens in the world. And we can think of these as sort of along a continuum, right? So tasks may be more or less open, more or less focused, more or less pedagogic, but still be tasks that are meaningful. Meaning is the point in the end. So let's look at an example task here and think about some of those features. So a task we might give, let's say we provide the students with these images. We might say, choose an image and describe it. Is that a real world task or is it pedagogic? It's more along the pedagogic side of things, right? Because that kind of thing doesn't happen so much in the real world. Can we make it more real world, more authentic? Well, yes, we can. We could, for example, ask the students to choose an image, choose a photo from their own album on their phone and describe that, right? Here's my mother. She has black hair. She is happy. That would then be a little bit more authentic, more real world. So we do this kind of thing in the real world, but this particular application of the task that I'm presenting here is a little bit more on the pedagogic side. You could have the students, for example, tell a story using these images. That would again it could be focused on the language of time markers, right? First they went shopping, and then they went for a drive, and then later that day, blah blah blah. So you might be wanting them to this kind of language to emerge during the lesson. Another way of looking at a task, which I think is really important and illustrative, is to think of the task is the unit of analysis. In other words, it's the basic meaningful unit of what we do in the class. The task is the answer to the question, what are we doing in class today, teacher? Right? So instead of saying today we're doing the past tense, you would say today we're telling a story, we're talking about our weekend, right? That's the task. That's the basic meaningful unit. It's how we then sequence lessons from one to the other. And the assessment is based on that too. If you don't think of the task as this basic meaningful unit, you tend to revert back to the grammar form, and that becomes the focus of the class. I like to think of the task as a kind of atomic element. It's the smallest reducible, still meaningful unit, right, of organization. Let me show you what that looks like as an example. So here is a kind of framework that I use for developing lesson plans. And you can see that at each of these levels, we have something that might reasonably be called a task, right? So work at a startup company. Is that a task? Well, it's at a bigger level, perhaps as a theme or a project, but it's still tasky in the sense that it's meaningful. It provides us with outcomes that can be measured and so on. But it can be broken down. We can break that down into things that we do in this kind of situation, this scenario. We can develop a product idea that could be a task, right? We choose a product to go into production, that could be a task, or a project, right? Really, because these can be broken down even further. So how would you break this down even further? Well, brainstorming a product idea could be an even smaller task. Can we break down this even further? Well, yes, we can, but then we kind of cross that meaningfulness threshold, right? And that's what I mean when I say it's kind of, think of it as an atom. We can go subatomic, but when we go subatomic, we lose meaning, right? There's still something there, it's the language function, but we sort of lose that meaningfulness, so it stops being a task, right? Tasks always have that focus on meaning. So a syllabus, a design framework like this one, will start from tasks and go towards in a kind of anticipatory way. The teacher anticipates the language and functions that may come out of the task, but not necessarily. So how do you plan to teach language? Well, you can't pre-teach the language, because once you pre-teach the language, you're trapping the students into that particular form and you lose some meaningfulness, right? Peter Skian calls this structure trapping, which I think is a great way to put it. You're trapping the students in the language that you pre-teach, and therefore when you say to them, here's the past tense, here are the different forms you can use, here are some verbs and irregular verbs and so on, let's practice them, and then you practice the past tense, and then you say to the students, okay, now forget about that, let's just have a conversation about something that happened in the past. Well, what are the students going to do? They're going to be focused on the past tense because that's what you taught, and they're going to be focused on accuracy rather than meaning. And what are you going to do? You're going to be testing them on that, I'm assuming, right? They're assuming anyway, that the test will be based on past tense. What else could it be? That's what the focus of the lesson is. This is why you don't pre-teach, but it doesn't mean that you don't teach. You do teach language, you do teach forms, you teach them as they emerge, ideally. And you can sort of predict what might emerge by the kind of tasks that you're setting up, right? So if you're setting up a brainstorming task where they're brainstorming product ideas, you can certainly predict that these kinds of descriptive language about describing what a product is likely to come up, right? And as a teacher, that's how you can prepare for the lesson. If something else comes up, of course, and it stumps you, you may have to tell the student, oh, I'll get back to you on that, later. But you can certainly anticipate many of the language forms and functions if you choose the task properly at the beginning. That's very different, by the way, from the grammar syllabus, right? What we might call PPP. This is what textbooks are, the structure the textbooks follow almost invariably, right? They go from language forms toward a meaning focus. The PPP model is present, practice, and produce, right? Present meaning the teacher presents the language. Practice meaning the students practice, maybe they do worksheets and they practice the language form, and then they get to produce something that's meaningful. That's a PPP model. And this is what 99% of the textbooks out there set up, right? So done well, it can be sort of communicative if you're a very good teacher and you are very aware of the fact that communicative tasks might get polluted by the language that you teach in the beginning. So it's not impossible to do a good job this way. It's just you're working backwards. What you really want to do is go from that meaning focus toward language forms focus if you can. And so this is why earlier on I mentioned it's difficult to make a textbook using a TBLT model, and that's partly the reason, right? It's difficult to anticipate language functions that may come up, and it's difficult to start from meaning. But I'll give you a couple of examples as we go. So I want to move on to talk about task sequencing, which is, of course, related to what I just mentioned about setting up tasks. And in fact, you probably got the idea of task sequencing a little bit from those little arrows that I had in my framework here. The idea in task-based learning is that you want to set up tasks from simpler to more complex as much as possible. Okay? And this is another point that Ellis brings up in his latest article. He very rightly says that task complexity may be kind of it's not practical for the classroom to think too much about task complexity. The idea of task complexity is very important, and a lot of really good research has been done on it. But in the classroom, at the classroom level, there are too many parameters, right? So what makes a task complex? Is it, for example, if we allow students to do a little bit of practice on their own, does that make it easier? Yes, it does. If we give them more time to prepare, if we give them less time to prepare, if we have them do presentation or longer essay that they are writing, for example, this will all affect task complexity. So, but having said that, task complexity is important, and we do want to set things up to go from simple to complex as much as possible. So what you do when you start setting up a lesson plan is, first of all, you come up with a plan. And I've got some examples here that I kind of put in of sort of overriding themes or projects that you might set up if you were creating a syllabus in which you want to set up a bunch of tasks, right? For the sake of expediency, I'm going to choose for you, but I've chosen this not because we would do it necessarily with students, but because it's something that teachers might have done before in their life, and so they might have that conceptual background, right? So planning a large event, such as a conference or a wedding, let's think about that and think about how we could break that down into smaller tasks, right? So, for example, we might want to arrange a venue. That would be another task that would go into that, right? We would want certainly to select speakers for our conference. We might want to do a call for papers, right? And you can already stop and think, wow, that's quite complex, right? A call for papers involves many subtasks, right? Each of these involves a number of subtasks. You can break them down even further. So, for example, choose a city, right? Research various venues in that city. Negotiate with the venues. These are all possible tasks that would go into such a project, right? Selecting speakers. You might want to research who the possible keynote speakers will be for your conference, and then select the keynote. That could be a discussion activity, a discussion task, or it could be some kind of writing task where students write their proposal and share with each other, right? We can then invite the keynote. What does that involve? That probably can be broken down into a couple of tasks as well, but writing an email, inviting the keynote could be a task, right? And so on, right? And the next level down from there is to anticipate what might come out of each of those tasks, right? So for choosing a city, you might have language that emerges like this, right? Comparatives and superlatives. So you might be talking about, this city is more accessible than this city. This city has better public transit than that city, or this city is clean, that city is not clean. Modal verbs like we could do this, we should do that. Vocabulary to do with various things relating to describing the city and so on, right? So this is the language that might come up. And so I've only done it here for choosing the city, but you would go through this chart and you would then outline what might come up, what you might anticipate at each of these points, right? Now, back to those little arrows, the importance of this is that once you have filled out a framework like this, you would then think about task complexity, and you might then want to adjust what you're doing. So you might decide, for example, choosing a city is let's keep it simple. We'll just choose a city, and then we don't have to do these other things. We want to have this simple task at the beginning, and then we'll jump into selecting speakers. And now let's make that a little bit more, put them in order by complexity. Once you have a theme in mind, once you're thinking of a scenario and a theme, it's actually relatively easy to be able to adjust by complexity in your mind. And because you know your own students as well, right? You're able to do that. You would then adjust where and how to put them. To give you an example, I'll talk a little bit about my book widgets now, but only because it's a syllabus, right? It's a textbook is a syllabus. And so how we designed it and sequenced by task complexity, it's a good example of how to do that. One example is, if you look here, stage 6, right? The interns, the students, prepare a resume and interview for a job. When we were first thinking of the idea of widgets, the idea of widgets is that students imagine that they're working at a company, and so they go through a variety of tasks and projects as they work in that company, right? And when we first came up with this concept, we thought, okay, well, what's the first task that you would do when you're working at a company? Well, you would get hired, right? So you'd have to have an interview. That seems like the first task that you would do. But when we thought about that, we thought, wait a second, we can't do that. An interview is far too complex to do at the beginning, and so it just doesn't fit. And so we adjusted that task complexity, and we put the interview at the end, and we thought, how can we put the interview at the end? That doesn't make any sense. Well, wait a second, it can make sense if the students are interns, and then at the end they have to interview to get a full-time job at the company, right? And so the theme of the syllabus, the theme that we were using, the scenario, helped us then to arrange how we did the complexity of the tasks. And then we started with something very simple, which is joining the company and do a kind of orientation, right? I'll go very quickly through the stages of the book here, but please think in terms of complexity and task sequencing, because that's what we were thinking here. So they start by meeting the characters that work at the company. They do very simple things like write a name card and introduce themselves to each other. They do very simple tasks, right? Shaking hands, getting to know each other, and so on. They watch some videos of workers giving them instructions of what they're going to do. They look at some example products that the company makes from the company catalog. And then stage 2, they join the research and development department. So they now are thinking about product proposals that they are going to make to the company. And this culminates in a task which is an elevator pitch, which is 1 minute long, and it's them presenting the product that they've come up with to one of their partners. They do also a writing task, which is writing the product proposal here. And then finally they move on to making a decision. Now they've got, so they're in teams, in groups, and each group has come up with a product proposal. Now they take those product proposals and give it to another team, and the other team now must make a decision. So they're weighing the pros and cons and debating which product is better than the other. And then finally they do a poster presentation. Now, in terms of sequencing, an elevator pitch is shorter, it's rehearsed, it's based on that simple point form information, whereas a poster presentation is a little bit longer, it's a little bit looser. There's repetition, where you have to say the same thing basically again and again to people, to the presenters, to the people you're presenting to. So you can see that the task complexity ramps up a little bit between the tasks here, the end tasks. And then the same thing, at the end of the next stage, they do a more formal presentation on market research. They now take the idea, they do market research, they present to the class. It's a group presentation. So again, it's a little bit more complex than the poster presentation, right? Because now they are speaking to an audience. And then again, the same thing, they do a different kind of presentation that's a little bit more complex again. And then at the end, stage 6, they do a job interview. Now, what's interesting within this scenario is that you can see the complexity ramps up very quickly, right? They start with name cards. Write a name card and say hello to each other. Very, 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 very simple. And they end with a job interview. How can you ramp up complexity so much? Well, you can, because within that scenario, it's everything that they're doing is meaningful and connected. So they can get up to that point where they are talking about meaningful things again at the end. So for example, at the end, when they have this interview, they talk to each other and they might have written a resume that says, I was a project manager in an advertising campaign, because they have done that in a simulated way, right? So they're having a meaningful interview about actual meaningful things that they have done, even though it's sort of virtual things, right? They're not pre-taught how. If you were to look at our syllabus into the book, I'll give you the link later, by the way, but if you were to look in, you will see that there's no explicit grammar instruction. It simply presents the situation and says, please go and do this. And you can see here, right? It leads the students to making a name tag and then going and introducing themselves, but it doesn't provide them with examples of, vocabulary about things, hobbies and things like that. We don't do that because doing that would be pre-teaching the language. You might think that it's impossible. Well, I want to show you this short video. This is during COVID when I had to do everything online. And what's happening in this video is I'm having a project manager interview this is towards the end of the course, with one of the students who was the project manager, and she was leading a team that were preparing a presentation, okay? Now, what's interesting about this video is that the level of the student is quite low. She is struggling to communicate, but she's doing a really good job, and she's being meaningful while she does it. Let's listen, and then I'll explain a little bit more. The project was to perform market research on a new product, quite complex, right, towards the end of the book. And these are the things they were doing. They had to run a survey, they had to analyze data, and then present the report using a slideshow.
Misaki, I gave the roles to Misaki.
What role did you give her?
Making PowerPoint.
Okay.
All members did make
Script.
Yeah.
You mean the writing of the
yes,
what you're going to say, right?
Yes.
Script.
It's each other.
Mm-hmm.
And
you mean they did it together? Okay, I'm going to stop here, but I just wanted to show you this example to show, this is another question that often comes up, is how can we do TBLT with very low-level learners? Well, this is quite a low-level learner here in our program, and she wouldn't normally be able to jump into doing this kind of interview, but because she has been doing these tasks already by this point for half the semester, right? It's been 6 weeks in which she's been participating in these meaningful tasks. She's now able to say, and wants to say, there's that gap, right? She wants to say what they did, what the team did. We worked on a presentation, we made a script, and so on. So I'm showing you this as an example of how it works even at low level, TBLT in general, right? If you are not focused on accuracy, again, the bowl of marbles, is it a bowl of marbles? Is this a bowl of marbles? Did she do the thing that she was supposed to do? Yes, she did. The interview actually was about 10 minutes long, so I'm only showing you a very short clip here. But she had a proper interview, a debriefing about what her project was, and she could do it. She achieved it. She achieved that outcome in an appropriate way. Is it perfect? No, it's not. Of course not, right? And if she were, for example, in an MBA course, perhaps it wouldn't be appropriate for a pass. But for the language skills course and the level that she's at now, she did well enough to pass. And then the next step would be for the teacher to provide feedback, right, about what could be better next time. Do this, don't do that, try this, right? But generally, she passed. She did well, right? And so task-based assessment, that's what we're looking at. So this is the third and final point. We're getting towards the end here. I'll show you a couple more examples in a minute, though. So task assessment, basically, you're looking at that outcome first, primarily, right? Is it a bowl of marbles? Is it a bowl of marbles? Is it a bowl of marbles, right? It's a very good picture, not a bowl of marbles, sorry. Give feedback, try again, right? And so basically, this is how you do TBLT assessment. Now, of course, there's more to it, and this is a rubric that I use. And the reason I have it numbered here 1, 2, 3 is because it's kind of a flow chart, right? First of all, you make that decision, yes or no, is the task outcome achieved? And if it's yes, then you move on to give it a score based on performance, right? And then you give feedback, right? So you might say to that student, yes, you did it, you passed, but you could have done better if you had prepared this and that, or if whatever it was, she didn't quite do well. I use here a modified version of Grice's maxims. I don't know if you're familiar with that from, if you're into pragmatics, you'll know about Paul Grice. But this actually was inspired by Kuiken and Vedder, who presented at the 2019 TBLT conference in Ottawa, and they've published a number of articles on what they call functional adequacy as a criterion for task-based assessment. In other words, you're looking at that task outcome. You're looking at whether something is done, right, first of all, and then you're looking at quality and how you can give feedback. So you may ask the student to redo the task if they miss the point of the task.
Hello, I'm going to talk about...
What? Hold on. So let's do an example here. And again, I talked before about elevator pitches. Let's look at this elevator pitch, and I want you to think about, number one, is it acceptable? And then number two, what score would you give, right? A, B, C, D, and so on. So let's go on.
Hello, I'm going to talk about my new product idea. This product will help many people who don't sleep immediately. I think many people has a trouble recently that they can't sleep immediately because their work and their phone. So I want to solve this problem. So I came up with this idea that I called Good Night Box. Good Night Box can let people fall asleep. So prepare your phone, and this is a Good Night Box. And how to use this? Good Night Box connect into this area. Phone has a hole in this area, and gas comes from here. The gas can make people sleep. So this is easy. What do you think of this idea?
All right. So what do you think of this idea? First of all, is it a pass or a fail? Does he achieve the task, right? And again, task outcome, this is an elevator pitch. Is it an elevator pitch? Right? The parameters that I had set is that it had to be about 1 minute. It had to be using any tools that you like, as long as you might be able to carry it with you into the hallway or the elevator. And it had to be relatively persuasive. Now, you may disagree with the idea that he has, right? I'm sure we can think of many reasons why this sleeping gas on your phone is probably not a good idea. Certainly not while you're driving, let's say. But is he being persuasive? Yes, he passes, right? And can we think of how well he did? So secondarily, what score would you give? 6, 7, 8, 9? In other words, C, D, C or up, right? C, B, A. What would you give? Maybe type it into the chat if you can. 6 to 7 out of 10. B, A. Okay. We're actually relatively all over the place today. That's interesting. I wonder if this is because we have teachers today who teach a variety of levels. Of course, it would depend on the context of your class as well, right? But I think when I have done this before, and I've shown this video hundreds of times in different presentations, we all seem to converge on a B-ish, right? It's not perfect. It could definitely be better. But it's better, he's good. He's better than just a C. He did more than just what the teacher asked. He went a step further and, tried to be persuasive. He practiced. He had his iPad ready and everything. And so it comes down often to an 8 out of 10 or a B, right? But we can certainly think. And so secondarily from here, we can think of other feedback that we might give, right? And so this is actually the feedback that I gave him. They basically did very well. It was clear and easy. It was fluent and confident and so on. There were a couple of small mistakes, by the way. Focus on this, focus on that, and that's it. He didn't have to redo the task again. In this case, there was no need to redo the task because the following stage they would do a similar task again. So there was already that built-in repetition. But if you wanted to, you could give an opportunity for them to try again from that feedback that you've just given, right? Another example that I wanted to show, and again from an assessment point of view, this is a project that I've been doing in my class recently, where I asked the students to choose something that they want to improve about themselves, some kind of skill that they might want to learn. You've always wanted to play the guitar, for example, or something like that. And then make a step-by-step plan to achieve that goal and then report on your weekly progress. This is the project. Now, by the way, I should have mentioned this a little bit earlier. A project is a task, right? A project fits into all of the criteria of what a task is. So it's meaningful. It has an outcome that you reach. You could do it without without pre-teaching, right? So if you set up a project as a task, you can certainly follow TBLT principles and do that. So this is a project, but it's also a task. And the task is basically to make a video report. But I set it up so that they would be doing, imagine you have a YouTube channel, and in your YouTube channel, this is what you're doing each week is you're presenting this task. So each week they made a little video and presented it. And so I'll play one or two here. These are only 1 minute long.
Hello guys, today I went to the supermarket and gathered some of ingredients to make omurice. This time I picked up olive oil, butter, eggs, and ketchup, and since I love cheese, I bought a lot of it. This time, to make it easier to compare, I'm planning to make omurice in every video using the same recipe. But this time, to show my true skill, I'm going to do without any practice. Then I melt butter in the frying pan, pour the 3 cooked eggs, quickly mix them, shave them, and place them on top of the ketchup rice. Finally, make a cut in the middle and open it. And this time, this is a complete failure. But the taste was very good. Next time, I'll think about why I failed and come up with a way to practice. Thank you for watching.
Okay, so we can think about how it went, but again, I think we would agree that this is a pass, right? He has done what was required. We can also think of feedback, and this is what we did in the class. Another, I think, interesting aspect of TBLT is that the feedback doesn't have to come only from the teacher. It can be peer feedback as well as self-feedback, self-assessment. And so what we did, because this was actually a very small class, I only had 5 students, so each week we would watch each other's videos, everyone would watch the videos, and give feedback to the student about what they can improve for next week's video, right? And this was actually the second cycle. They had already done a previous project cycle for the first few weeks, so that's why it's already quite good. But again, you can increase the quality of the output that the students get by repeating tasks to a certain extent as much as possible, but in a way that you're not drilling, right? And so it goes on. I'm not going to show you all the videos, but let's say...
Hello guys, today I went to the supermarket and... Hello guys.
It didn't work.
Hello guys, and welcome to my second video of this oral communication project.
And what happened is, so the task cycle in this case would be, they would sit down, they would give feedback watching the videos, and then they would sit down and prepare what their next week's video is going to be. They would talk to each other about what they can do. So in this case, the guy wanted to be a better cook, right? One of the other students in the class was good at cooking, so it was giving him advice about what to do and what not to do. There was another girl in the class who wanted to play the guitar. She wanted to learn how to play the guitar. Well, one of the students in the class could play the guitar, so they would just start talking about, here are some tips, go to this YouTube channel, try this, try that. And my job as a teacher then became to just make sure that they're doing it in English, right? Because they were all Japanese students, so they could easily do it in their first language. So then your job as a teacher becomes this facilitator and reminding the students that the purpose is to do it in English, right? Let's move on.
Hello guys.
And finally, a higher level. I know we're out of time here. I'm going to show you another clip of a more complex project that we did. And now this was in my linguistics course, where the students had to do basically a research project over the entire semester. And each week I was guiding them through what they were doing. And so in the end, they had to make a presentation. They had to do all of these things, choose a topic, research it, give a 10-minute presentation. And this was guided each week, and they had some deadlines to meet throughout the process. But basically, they would sit down with me and show me what they had done, what research they had done. I would give them some feedback. And by the end, we had some pretty good stuff. Like, I'm not going to show you the 10-minute video, don't worry, but I'll show you just a couple of minutes, a few seconds of it to show the quality of the thing.
Hello everyone, my name is and today I will be presenting on the topic, to what extent can emojis be considered a part of language? This presentation will explore how emojis function from a linguistic perspective and whether they can be considered a part of human language. All right, let's begin.
All right, now probably I'm guessing some of you are sitting there going, wait a second, she used AI, right? It's too good. It is very good. But one of the benefits of doing this, cycling through each week and doing a little bit, and with the teacher feedback the way we did it, is that, and her language level is much higher. Like, remember, this is a content course, but her language, her actual language is a little bit lower than the level we're hearing here. What she did is she practiced a lot. And so it comes out as being much more fluent than you would expect. She is a second language learner, but because she practiced and worked through this, it's better than you would expect, right? And also because she would come to me and show me each week what she was doing. She did a little mini survey, right? She did and this was very interesting. She did a survey about the meaning of emojis. And so she went out and asked people, this emoji, what does it mean? What does it mean? What does it mean? And her results were very odd. She had actually quite interesting results that were unexpected, which I then gave her feedback on. She came back and did it again. It was odd because there was a generation difference between how we interpret emojis. She came back to me and said that 80% of the people said that a smiling emoji is negative, not positive. And I went, wait a second, that can't be right. And that's because young people today use it sarcastically. So when they see a smiling emoji, they often think it's a negative meaning, which was quite interesting. My point here is that because we had been working together meaningfully developing this task as we went along, at the end, when she presented this 10-minute, near perfect presentation, I didn't have any doubts as to whether she used AI. I didn't have any problems with her research because I knew she had done it, right? And that's one of the big benefits of TBLT because it's very hands-on and you're focused on emerging language. The other students, I'm not going to show you here, but the other students who did use AI, it was striking because I had never seen them in class prepare anything. At the end, they came out with this presentation that was too good for their level and was very bland because AI, of course, is not going to choose an actually interesting topic. And so it was quite easy to see what the problem was. And self-assessment becomes an important thing as well because she had just worked on that video and she worked very hard on it. So now she's in a good position to be able to assess how other students have done a project as well, because she can watch other videos and basically say from her own experience whether they seem to have prepared better or worse than she did. So it becomes a little bit more reliable and valid, the assessment that comes from peer assessment. So I'm getting, well, I am at the end. I just wanted to mention the task-based learning in Tokyo conference that's happening next month, if some of you are coming. And I also wanted to give you my contact information. And if you're interested in taking a look at widgets, you can go online to our website, and there's lots of information there. I'm going to stop talking here now to see if we can get a couple of questions, and then maybe we'll finish. And if anybody sends me an email, I'll be happy to follow up on some of these things.
Okay, yes.
Thank
Okay.
you.